Hello, one and all. Welcome back to the Skyrim Archaeological Survey. I am joined, as ever, by I suspect, slightly spooky Liv Westring. How are you
Yes.
doing at the moment?
Hello. I'm doing great. It's spooky season again. I'm happy.
It is. It's very much firmly become my favourite time of the year.
Yes.
It's magnificent. Do you have any plans in the build up to Halloween?
Well, I'm doing vampire LARPing on Halloween, or well, that weekend, since Halloween
Uh
is
huh.
on a Thursday today this year.
Okay.
And we're having a horror movie night tonight, me and a couple of friends.
Oh, any movies that I would know?
We're going on a broad undead theme tonight, so possibly Nosferatu.
Mm.
We're probably going to be watching like The Crow or
Oh, okay, okay.
and/or Halloween. Uh,
Oh, I see. So specifically undead as opposed to zombified, for example.
yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And also, of course, Nosferatu is not necessarily specifically a vampire, although that's a whole other conversation. But okay,
Yes.
okay. Nonetheless, speaking of undead, we have been inspired in this episode of the Skyrim Archaeological Survey to examine a couple of books from the world of Skyrim, and interestingly, they both look
Mhm.
exactly the same.
Yes.
So I'm
A
just
very profile.
very
What's the word, Mark?
uh, I'm not quite sure. Profligate?
A very niche
Oh, niche.
publisher.
Oh, niche publisher. Yes, a very niche publisher. I mean, I'm literally clicking between the two different books, and you just wouldn't know. Right down
Yep.
to the speckling and the erosion. Maybe there's a stipulation when they
Mhm.
sell these books. You will nibble on this bit, and you will draw here and there to make sure that your book looks precisely the same as all others. But all jokes aside, these two books are both linked with broader aspects of some of the questions that we've been wondering about with regards to
Mhm.
Draugr and the context in particular of the monuments that they're found in. So one book is called The Dragon War by Torhall Bjork.
Mhm.
It's costs about 12 septims, 12 gold,
Mhm.
seemingly, in the world. And the other book is Dragon Language Myth No More by Hella Thrice Versed. The book's cost is 14 septim or
Mhm.
gold in the world. So which one do you fancy looking at first?
I'm thinking it's good to have a look at the dragon language first to
Uh-huh.
get kind of a basic for diving into the Dragon Wars.
Okay, okay, good idea, good idea. Well, this one is quite long, but I think it warrants
Hmm.
it warrants examining. So the very word conjures nightmare images of shadowed skies, hideous roaring, and endless fire. Indeed, the dragons were terrifying beasts that were once as numerous as they were deadly. But what most Nords don't realize is that the dragons were in fact not simple mindless beasts. Instead, they were thriving, intelligent, cultured beasts, one bent on elimination or enslavement of any non-dragon civilization in the entire world. It therefore stands to reason that the dragons would require a way to communicate with one another, that they would need to speak, and, through much research, scholars have determined that this is exactly what the dragons did. For many roars of the beasts, even with those roars containing fire, ice, or some other deadly magic, were actually much more than roars. They were words, words in an ancient, though decipherable, tongue. Now, it's worthwhile, I suppose, commenting on the fact that this isn't unique to Skyrim and its mythology. This idea of
Mm.
dragons being an overarching class of monsters in the world prior to humans. For example, the world of Dark Souls, I think, has an age which was dominated by dragons, and then they were overthrown by godlike beings. But I suppose what my question is, what do you make of this idea of dragons with language? Because it makes me think of of Dragonheart with Sean Connery as the dragon. Um,
I think it's, I mean, if you're going to stipulate dragons as an intelligent race, it's
mhm.
natural that they have a language.
Yeah.
And I enjoy uh, where the dragon language isn't the
Hmm.
common language.
Hmm.
Because I find it's weird when a whole world shares like just one language.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Different cultures should have different languages.
Well, actually, speaking of which, it's interesting, isn't it, that in lots of sci-fi, when I mean, we're getting slightly off topic here, but lots of sci-fi, when you go to another planet, everyone on the planet is the same. It's the same.
Hmm.
There's one look. There's one essentially one localized species that seemingly populates the entire planet, and I wonder whether we're supposed to think that for example, I know Captain Picard or something, the whole planet just looks the same. Ergo,
Hmm.
to an alien, we would all look basically, well, yeah, they're all basically the same. They've got two arms, two legs, a face, and other bits and bobs going on.
Yeah.
Or whether this is one of the weaknesses of some sci-fi is to forget to populate the worlds with a richness of life that we see in well, for example, in the real world, in our world.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe. And I'm also thinking that it might be a perspective where we essentially have one species that we can communicate with in
Mm.
our like view of reality,
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, which makes it easy to make everything kind of similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Yeah. A little bit. Well, actually, a little bit like that Star Trek movie when they had to go and rescue some whales from the
hmm.
past.
Hmm.
But anyway, we're not here to talk about Star Trek.
No, no, this is not a sci-fi video.
No. Um, Nonsense, you say. Sheer folly on the part of some over-eager academics. I thought precisely the same thing, but then I started hearing rumours. The old snippet of a conversation from some brave explorer or gold-coveting crypt diver. And always, always, it was the same word repeating. Wall. So I listened more. I began to arrange pieces of the puzzle and slowly unravel the mystery. Spread throughout Skyrim, in ancient dungeons, burial grounds, and other secluded places, there are walls. Black, ominous walls, on which is written a script so old, so unknown, that none who had encountered it could even begin its translation. In my heart, I came to know the truth. This was proof of the ancient dragon language. For what else could it be? It only made sense that these walls were constructed by the ancient Nords, who had lived in the time of the dragons, and out of fear or respect, had somehow learned and used the language of those ancient beasts. Now, this is going to be interesting when we come to think about, for example, the Dragon Wars in terms of how
Hmm.
that's mediated access to knowledge and all that kind of thing. But okay, fair enough. Um, but at that point, all I had was my own gut instinct. What I needed was proof. Thus began the adventure of my life, spanning 17 months. What? Okay, the adventure of my life so far, spanning 17 months, and the deaths of three courageous guides and two sellsword protectors. Blimey. But I choose not to dwell on those grim details, for the end result was so glorious it made any hardship worth it. In my
If you say
travels,
so.
yeah, well, yeah, if you say so, yeah. Um, in my travels, I found many of the ancient walls, and every suspicion was proved true. It did, in fact, appear as if the ancient Nords had copied the language of the dragons of old, for the characters of that language very much resemble claw marks or scratches. Now, I like that. That's quite
Hmm.
cool because it's basically how well, basically how we started language, isn't it? I mean, some Ogham, for example, is a very early script, literally scratches on rock. I suppose
Hmm.
you have script coming out of Mesopotamia, which is sort of impressions on wet clay. And of course, uh, sitting talking to someone in Sweden, there are runes as well, carved, for example, into wood and
Yeah.
stone, this kind of thing. So this is, yeah, this is to be expected, I suppose. But
Hmm.
and also, I guess, from what we see of the dragons in the game, I don't think they could use, for example, their tail in such a delicate
No.
way. No. So yeah, using your claws. Although I like the idea of them having reading spectacles as well, sort of. Yeah. One can almost envision a majestic dragon using his great sharp talons to carve the symbols into the stone itself, and a human witness, possibly even a thrall or servant, learning and observing, so that he too could use the language for his own ends. For as I observed the walls I found, I noticed something peculiar about some of the words. It was as if they pulsed with a kind of power, an unknown energy that, if unlocked, might be harnessed by the reader. That sounds like nonsense, I know, but if you had stood by these walls, seen their blackness, felt their power, you would understand that of which I speak. Thankfully, although entranced, I was able to retain enough sense to actually transcribe the characters I saw, and in doing so, I began to see patterns in the language, patterns that allowed me to decipher what it was I was reading. For example, I transcribed the following passage. Now, I wonder if she's actually going to tell us how the translations were achieved, because this looks like a series of translations without method. But
Hmm.
but we shall see. We shall see. And then we get a series of marks, which seems to read something like Het nok ungavar gif codiv wardri I. Why for? Moron o frod do crosis nus sinon S3V dinok for RK Duke 1N. Okay. Uh, Assigning those scratchings to actual Tamrielic language characters, I further translated what I saw into this. Okay, so there's a transliteration going on there, I suppose.
Hmm.
Um, First of all, and then a translation there. Okay. Um, oh, so okay, so I didn't have to read that like that then. Het nog ungervar gath kodav wodre ja moron ofro dokrosis nu sinon siv dinok ach Dukan, which translates into Tamrielic as follows. Here lies Ungarvar, Ghost Bear, who did seek glory on the battlefield of sorrows, but instead found death and dishonour. Then, in another crypt, I encountered a wall with this transcription, which translates into Het nog kopran do iklev, so on and so forth, which ultimately translates via Tamrielic as here lies the body of Iglif Iceblood, who met his end not in glorious combat, but at the cruel touch of the withering sickness. And there you see the pattern, the repeated words, here lies, which could only mean one thing. Those walls marked actual ancient Nord burial grounds. Now that's important to note, I suppose. We
Hmm.
have here someone's observation. I guess if we ever come across a wall that doesn't accompany a burial, then it's problematic. That said, though, it was pointed out in the last video that there is close to the wall uh, in Bleak Fall. Um,
Hmm.
so actually, it doesn't. Oh, it's not always the case that actually there is a burial. Mm, mm. You can imagine my nearly uncontainable excitement. It all started to make sense. The ancient Nords used the dragon language for these walls were for very specific reasons. One of them was obviously to mark the grave of some important figure. But what else? Were they all graves, or did they serve another purpose as well? I set off
Good
on I
questioning.
set off to find out, and was well rewarded for my efforts. Here's what I discovered. So we have the passage, we have the translation, which is as follows. Here fell the treacherous thief, uh,
Skoy.
yeah, Leech Fingers, whose head was removed by the very axe he was attempting to steal. Ah. So here we have a wall that marks the spot where some significant ancient Nord died, as opposed to where he was buried. Okay, that's a subtle difference. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Next translation is this stone commemorates the doomed elf children of the autumn field who fled in terror from the sharp swords of the ancient enemy. This wall seems to commemorate some ancient, long forgotten event in Tamrielic history. Whether that event occurred on or near this place, where the wall was erected, we'll probably never know. And finally, this passage, which translated through to Asa raised this stone for her sister, Thohild, and Inferno, whose passion burned hot as the red forge. My. This wall, and I encountered quite a few like this, says the author, was obviously commissioned or built by a specific person to honour someone important to them. What was the significance of the location? What is the importance of the person who died? Or is it the actual location of the person's death? Again, those answers are probably lost in time, or lost to time, and we will never know. And as you see, the ancient dragon language is indeed myth no more. It existed, but better yet, it still exists, and probably will until the end of time, thanks to the ancient Nords and their construction of these many word walls. But don't take my word for it. For the walls are there for the discovering in Skyrim's dangerous and secret places. They serve as a bridge between the realm of the ancient Nords and our own. The dragons may never return to our world, but now we can return to theirs. And someday, we may even unlock the strange, unknown power hidden in the words. Oh,
Mm.
that's quite good. I like that.
Yeah.
There's a slightly, I like the way that it obviously is written without any expectation that you're going to come along as the Dragonborn and achieve
Yeah.
this. Um, but also, I think I quite like the way that it's pulling on. Uh, in the past, I've heard this game described as being a realized version of Vikings culture and
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Though people have written papers about it, and I like the idea that they're drawing on this idea that words have power
Yeah.
and that writing something means something important. So rune stones, for example, often are they are brief and they are to the point, but that's because what they're writing is so meaningful in the moment on that surface.
And I mean, a lot of runestones share the same kind of theme when it
Mm,
comes to the inscriptions.
hmm
They
hmm
often commemorate someone who has fallen or who has been lost.
mm, mm.
Uh,
So again, very similar themes there, definitely. I guess I was about to say, I guess the limiting factor on a real world runestone is size and space, incorporating it into the design on a chunk of rock. But I
yeah,
suppose actually, if you think about the word walls compared to the size of a dragon, uh, I guess the question there would it be difficult for them to write on that space? But then again, it looks as though that's not necessarily the case, is it? It looks as though
not in
this
this
is
thesis anyway.
no, this is people using that language
Mm-hmm.
on these spaces. So I suppose there's a question there about as to why the size of the wall is fairly uniform, or these walls, beyond obviously it being um, a game asset that's repeated through the
Mm-hmm.
world.
But I mean, if you look at the whole of runestones, they are fairly similar
Hmm.
uh, in like shape and size.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there are absolutely stylistic like cues in
Mhm.
runestones
Mhm. Mhm.
from different time periods and like
Yeah. Yeah.
space.
Well, and also I suppose another aspect of runestones would be the artistry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just words, but also accompanying images of people, or I think there's a very famous one with people in a ship, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose there's the extent to which you want to let the imagery do the talking as well, I suppose. Uh, okay, cool. So the dragon language, myth no more. And the second book we're going to be examining today is little bit briefer. It is The Dragon War, and it's described as a religious text describing the primordial war between men and dragons. Or should that be humans and dragons, possibly?
Mm-hmm.
In the Merethic era, when Ysgramor first set foot on Tamriel, his people brought with them a faith that worshipped animal gods. Certain scholars believe these primitive people actually worshipped the divines as we know them, just in the form of these totem animals. They deified the hawk, wolf, snake, moth, owl, whale, bear, fox, and the dragon. Every now and then you can stumble across the broken stone totems in the farther reaches of Skyrim. And this, I think, is part of the answer, if not the complete answer, but in different applied in different ways to the question that we keep on having when we come across the freezes in these
Mm-hmm.
spaces, where you see these figures often surrounded by animalistic forms. I've definitely, I think, seen a moth,
Yeah.
and we've seen whales as well, and wolves, and therefore actually the relationship, I guess, between the god that may well be one of the divines, the animalistic element of that god, and therefore putting it on the wall starts to make more sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And it's also interesting that we in that case find all the gods represented in some way in most big dungeons, not only the dragons.
It is, yeah, it is, and I guess I suppose that reinforces the fact that it is the humans who are writing the word
Mm-hmm.
walls as well, because the dragons wouldn't want other things represented necessarily. Foremost among all animals was the dragon. In the ancient Nordic tongue, it was dragon. Occasionally, the term dora was used, but the language or derivation of that is not known. Using either name was forbidden to all except dragon priests. Grand temples were built to honor the dragons and appease them. Many of them survive today as ancient ruins, haunted by Draugr and the undead dragon priests. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Dragons, being dragons, embrace their role as god kings over men. After all, were they not fashioned in Akatosha's own image? Were they not superior in every way to the hordes of small, soft creatures that worshipped them? For dragons, power equals truth. They had the power, therefore it must be truth. Dragons granted small amounts of power to the dragon priests in exchange for absolute obedience. In turn, the dragon priests ruled over men as equals to the kings. Dragons, of course, could not be bothered with actually ruling. In Atmora, where Ysgramor and his people came from, the dragon priests demanded tribute and set down laws and codes of living that kept peace between dragons and men. In Tamriel, they were not nearly as benevolent. It's unclear if this was due to an ambitious dragon priest, or a particular dragon, or a series of weak kings. Whatever the cause, the dragon priests began to rule with an iron fist, making virtual slaves of the rest of the population. When the populace rebelled, the dragon priests retaliated. When the dragon priests could not collect tribute to control their masses, the dragon's response was swift and brutal. So it was that the Dragon War began. At first, men died by the thousands. The ancient texts reveal that a few dragons took the sides of men. Why they did this is not known. The priest of the nine divines claim it was Akatosh himself that intervened. From these dragons, men learned magics to use against dragons. The tide began to turn, and dragons began to die too. The war was long and bloody. The dragon priests were overthrown, and dragons were slaughtered in large numbers. The surviving dragons scattered, choosing to live in remote places away from men. The dragon cult itself adapted and survived. They built the dragon mounds, entombing the remains of dragons that fell in the war. They believed that one day the dragons would rise again and reward the faithful. And the thing is, I suppose those people were right. The dragons did rise again, and I guess the question is, who are they looking to reward? Are there any faithful people still in the world of Skyrim? I'm not sure I've come across. for example, people actively bringing stuff to the mounds and maintaining the
Oh.
mounds. Um, but uh, but I suppose, as you say, there are cultists out there
Mm-hmm.
who may well be interested in maintaining this sort of devotion. Uh, but it's interesting this very strong hint that the dragon religion adapted.
Yeah. And I
Hmm.
mean, I'm thinking that's incredibly human.
Hmm. Oh well, definitely, definitely. I mean, arguably, uh, yeah, arguably the power structure amongst the wealthy in Rome became cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely something that people in positions of power do when things change around them. I
And I
s
mean, they still had some pull. I mean, they still had dragon bodies. They still had a clear enemy, which can be important in a crisis of faith,
uh
as I imagine the dragons dying would be.
Yeah, or I suppose, as it was probably painted along the lines of the dragons, a bit like King Arthur. The
Mm-hmm.
dragons will return one day to when we need them. I suppose, how do you think then these two books relate to our research then? Do you think it's worthwhile to keep an eye out for, and specifically try to recognize the nine divines when we see them, for example?
Potentially, and I also think they give a very important background to understanding the spaces and what they were for.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, I mean, now we know, or we have at least someone who think they know, that the dragon or that the murals are man-made and not
Yes.
commissioned by the dragons, but by the populace themselves.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. And also this idea of relationship between not only word walls and burials, but also word walls and significant events, or word
Indeed.
walls and memorialization. That's important because it answers in part the question of Bleak Falls Barrow as to
Mm-hmm.
why there wasn't a dragon priest buried nearby. Uh, I guess. I mean, I wonder how much longer we're going to be able to circle and to circumnavigate the world without actually going to places like the Labyrinthian and really looking at this
Mm-hmm.
in massive detail. Um, but there have been actually a couple of suggestions on the previous video as to locations for our next
Yeah.
survey. So we'll have a look at those, and we'll definitely keep an eye out. Um, I suppose all that remains to say is, those of you at home uh, watching this, if you've noticed anything in these books, or a question that comes out of this that you think we
Mm-hmm.
haven't addressed, please do comment below. We do read the comments. We'll definitely add
Yes.
that to our ongoing survey.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I guess I guess actually I'm really pleased the way that this is coming together. I know this sounds really daft, but I was kind of like, is this really going to work? But it does work because
Yeah.
they've made such a world here that the architecture, even though it has that necessary in-game repetition, because again it's a constructed digital space, the logic is sound. I like
Mm-hmm.
that. I'm really enjoying that.
And I'm also really enjoying the engagement. Like we get a lot more comments than we usually do, and they're actually related to what we're doing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Really
yeah.
interesting questions and suggestions.
Yeah. So for my part, it's really lovely to read comments that aren't telling me horrible things about Celts and stuff, but accusing me of all sorts of well, shall we say, betrayal of
Mm-hmm.
my people. How delightful is that? So. On that glorious note, let's close up, I suppose, just by saying um, that I I think that we're still not going to go straight to the Labyrinthian, though. I think whatever we do,
No,
no.
it's a really big space.
Yeah, I think we might have to have some, maybe at least one private look around, just to think about
Mm-hmm.
how we're going to break it up. But yeah, but we'll
We'll
make an
get to
announcement on the
it
community. We
one
will,
day.
we will, we will. Right, okay. Well, thank you guys for watching. As ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.